The German shells explode just 50 yards from where Private Thomas Clarke crouches behind a broken seawall, clutching a water-stained photograph of a girl named Elizabeth, the French nurse who saved his life and stole his heart just 3 days ago. But now the evacuation boats are leaving Dunkirk beach, and he must choose between his own survival and a promise to find her in the chaos of a burning town. Welcome to War Stories by the Campfire, where we share inspirational true war stories from history's greatest moments of courage. Comment below and let us know where you're tuning in from tonight. Picture yourself settling in by a warm fire as we journey back to May 1940 to the beaches of Dunkirk, France. The British Expeditionary Force finds itself trapped between the German army and the English Channel. But in the midst of this desperate evacuation, love found a way to bloom even in the darkest hour. This is the story of a soldier and a nurse whose hearts connected across the divide of war. Private Thomas Clarke of the Royal West Kent Regiment had been fighting in France for 8 months when the German blitzkrieg shattered the Allied lines. At 22, he was a carpenter's son from Canterbury who had joined up the day Britain declared war, leaving behind his quiet life building church pews and garden sheds. As British forces retreated toward Dunkirk, Thomas found himself separated from his unit during a fierce German artillery barrage. Wounded by shrapnel in his left shoulder and bleeding heavily, he stumbled through the ruins of a small French village, looking for shelter and medical aid. It was there, in the basement of a bombed-out church converted into a makeshift aid station, that he first saw Elizabeth Dubois. She was 23, a French nurse who had refused to evacuate with other civilians, staying behind to tend wounded soldiers of any nationality. Her dark hair was pulled back under a white cap stained with dust and blood, but her eyes held a warmth that seemed to push back the darkness of war. Thomas collapsed just inside the doorway, and Elizabeth was there instantly, her gentle hands examining his wound while she spoke in accented English. "You are safe now," she said, helping him to a makeshift bed. "I will take care of you." For 2 days, Elizabeth tended to Thomas's wounds while German shells fell around the village. She cleaned and dressed his shoulder, brought him water and what little food she could find, and sat beside him during the worst bombing raids. They talked about their lives before the war, his carpentry work in Canterbury, her nursing training in Paris, their dreams of peaceful tomorrows that seemed impossible in those dark days. Thomas told her about the cathedral bells that rang every Sunday morning in his hometown, how he loved the sound of wood shavings curling away from his plane, the satisfaction of building something beautiful that would last. Elizabeth spoke of her patients at the hospital in Lille, her love of reading poetry by candlelight, her dream of seeing the English countryside she had only read about in novels. On the second night, as they huddled together during a particularly fierce bombardment, Thomas took her hand. "I never believed in love at first sight," he said, "until I opened my eyes and saw you." Elizabeth smiled, her fingers intertwining with his. "The war has taught me that love cannot wait for perfect timing," she replied. "We must hold on to it whenever we find it." But their time together was running short. Word came that the evacuation at Dunkirk was underway, and wounded soldiers were being moved to the beach. Elizabeth helped Thomas to his feet, wrapping his arm in a makeshift sling. "You must go," she said. "Your people need you alive." Thomas pulled out a small photograph of himself in uniform, taken just before he shipped out to France. He pressed it into Elizabeth's hands, along with a letter he had written to his parents. "When this war is over, I will come back for you," he promised. "Wait for me." Elizabeth reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother. Inside was a photograph of herself as a young girl, standing in a field of sunflowers. She placed it around Thomas's neck. "This will bring you home safely," she said, "and I will be waiting." The journey to Dunkirk beach took 6 hours, with Thomas and other wounded soldiers loaded onto a farm cart pulled by an old horse. Every bump sent pain shooting through his shoulder, but he kept his hand pressed against the locket, thinking of Elizabeth's promise. When they reached the beach, Thomas was overwhelmed by the sight. Thousands of British soldiers stretched along the sand, waiting in long lines for boats that would take them home. Royal Navy destroyers stood offshore, while smaller vessels, fishing boats, pleasure craft, tugboats, and lifeboats ferried men from beach to larger ships. But as Thomas waited in line with other wounded soldiers, he realized something that made his heart race with panic. Elizabeth was still back in that village, alone with German forces closing in. The aid station where she worked would be overrun within hours. The medical orderly helping Thomas toward one of the boats noticed his distress. "Come on, mate," he said. "Your boat's ready. Time to go home." Thomas looked at the boat, then back toward the smoke rising from the direction of Elizabeth's village. Every instinct told him to climb aboard, to sail to safety. But his heart told him something different. "I can't leave," Thomas said, stepping out of line. "There's someone I have to find." The orderly looked at him as if he had lost his mind. "Are you mad? The Germans will be here by morning. This might be the last boat out." Thomas touched the locket around his neck and thought of Elizabeth's face. "I made a promise too," he said. What followed was the most dangerous journey of Thomas's life. He made his way back through the French countryside, dodging German patrols and artillery fire, his wounded shoulder throbbing with every step. It took him all night to reach the village, and when he arrived, he found the aid station abandoned except for Elizabeth, who was packing the last medical supplies. She looked up as he stumbled through the doorway, her face white with shock. "Thomas, what are you doing here? You should be safe on a ship by now." "I couldn't leave without you," he said, falling to his knees from exhaustion and blood loss. "I promised I would come back for you." Elizabeth knelt beside him, her eyes filling with tears. "You foolish, wonderful man," she whispered. "You came back." But there was no time for sentiment. German voices could be heard in the distance, growing closer. Elizabeth helped Thomas to his feet, grabbed her small bag of belongings, and together they fled into the French countryside. For 3 days, they made their way across occupied France, hiding in barns, abandoned buildings, and forest clearings. Elizabeth's knowledge of the local area and her ability to speak French helped them avoid German patrols, while Thomas's military training kept them safe from battlefield dangers. They finally reached the coast near Calais, where French resistance fighters helped them board a small fishing boat, making clandestine runs across the channel. As they sailed through the night toward the English coast, Thomas and Elizabeth held each other close, watching stars reflect on the dark water. When they arrived in Dover, Thomas was immediately taken to a military hospital, while Elizabeth was processed as a refugee. They were separated for 2 weeks, but finally Thomas was released and given leave to recover from his wounds. He found Elizabeth staying with a family in Dover who had taken in French refugees. She was working as a volunteer nurse at the local hospital, using her skills to help wounded soldiers evacuated from Dunkirk. When Thomas appeared at the hospital door, Still wearing his uniform and carrying his kit bag, Elizabeth ran to him across the ward. They were married 3 months later in Canterbury Cathedral, the same church where Thomas had listened to those Sunday morning bells as a boy. Elizabeth wore a simple white dress made from parachute silk, and Thomas wore his dress uniform with a silver locket still around his neck. The war continued for 5 more years, and Thomas served with distinction in North Africa and Italy, while Elizabeth worked as a nurse in London during the Blitz. They wrote letters to each other every day, Elizabeth keeping Thomas's photograph in her pocket, while he kept her locket close to his heart through every battle. They both survived the war and returned to Canterbury, where Thomas went back to his carpentry work, and Elizabeth became head nurse at the local hospital. They raised 4 children together, and Thomas built them a beautiful home with his own hands, complete with a garden where Elizabeth grew sunflowers in memory of the photograph in the locket. Thomas and Elizabeth Clarke were married for 57 years, until Elizabeth passed away peacefully in 1997. Thomas lived for 3 more years, and when he died in 2000, he was buried with the silver locket still around his neck. So there you have it, the story of Thomas and Elizabeth, whose love story began in the chaos of Dunkirk and lasted a lifetime. That water-stained photograph we heard about at the beginning? Thomas carried it with him through the entire war, and Elizabeth kept it on her bedside table until the day she died. Sometimes the greatest victories of war are not won on battlefields, but in the human heart's refusal to give up on love. Did you enjoy tonight's story? If so, please hit that like button and subscribe. It's completely free and helps us bring you these incredible true stories from history. And here's a question for you. Would you have had the courage to leave the safety of that evacuation boat to go back for someone you loved? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, this has been War Stories by the Campfire. We release new videos every day, so make sure you anchor your heart to our channel by hitting that subscribe button for your daily dose of real war stories from throughout history. Sleep well, and remember that even in the darkest times, love finds a way.